They say the West is simple, good people, hard land, and decisions that don't take long to make. But that was before a woman in a pressed city coat walked into a forgotten barn and found 3 newborn triplets left behind, like a secret the world didn't want to name. And before a rough cowboy who trusted the land more than people decided that sometimes doing the right thing means standing against everything that calls itself right. What begins as a routine property evaluation quickly turns into a moral fracture, where law, survival, and human compassion stop, agreeing with each other. And in that silence between rules and responsibility, something fragile begins to form, a connection neither of them planned, neither of them can fully explain, and neither of them can walk away from unchanged. This channel is dedicated to stories of Western cowboys, love in the American frontier, motherhood, and the quiet humanity found between broken people learning how to care for each other again. This story reminds us that not every right decision feels clean, and not every legal decision is morally right. Sometimes, love is not about possession. It is about protection, sacrifice, and choosing to carry emotional weight that no rulebook can measure. If this story touched you, please support the channel by liking, commenting what you think you would have done in their place, sharing with someone who loves emotional Western stories, and subscribing for more heartfelt stories of love, loss, and human dignity under the open sky.
I arrived at the ranch just after noon, when the light out here in the West feels too honest to hide anything. No filters, no softness, just sun stretched thin over dry land, and a sky so wide it almost felt like it was pressing down instead of opening up. The road had been rough for the last 20 miles, gravel giving way to dirt, and then dirt giving way to something that didn't feel like a road, so much as a suggestion that people had once passed through here and decided not to stay. I kept my eyes on the property line as I pulled in. That S what I was here for. Boundaries, value, access, risks. In the passenger seat was my folder, thick, organized, labeled in color-coded tabs that meant something only to people like me. Legal descriptions, title history, environmental notes, evaluation model built from numbers that had already been checked twice. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. I already knew what I was going to find, or at least I thought I did. There was one more thing I carried with me that I didn't write down in any report. A number I had set in my head. The maximum offer, the ceiling. Not emotional, not negotiable. Just a line I would not cross, because crossing it meant losing control of the job, and control was the only thing that made this work feel like something other than dressed up as professionalism. The ranch came into view all at once, like it had been waiting to be noticed rather than approached. A main house off to the left, weathered wood porch that sagged slightly in the middle like it had been holding too many years at once. And farther back, a barn large, old, patched in places where time had clearly been more persistent than maintenance. The air felt off, not in a dramatic way, not like a storm was coming. It was quieter than that, the kind of stillness animals notice before people do. Even my rental truck seemed to hesitate when I cut the engine. A dog lay near the porch steps. It didn't bark, didn't lift its head, just watched me like it had already. Decided it was important enough to react to. That moo, that alone, told me more about this place than any file I'd read. I stepped out, boots hitting dry ground, and immediately felt it, that subtle resistance underfoot, like the land was to welcoming pressure so much as tolerating it. The barn doors were slightly open. That caught my attention more than anything else, because barns don't stay slightly open by accident. I adjusted my grip on the folder and started walking. Halfway there, I noticed something I couldn't categorize right away. Not movement exactly, not sound either. More like a rhythm that didn't belong to the wind or the land. It came and went too unevenly, like breathing, but not adult breathing. I stopped for a second, listening. Nothing. Then it came again. A small sound, high, fragile. Not an animal. I moved faster. The barn doors groaned when I pushed them open, and the smell hit me first: hay, dust, old wood, and something else underneath that my mind didn't want to name immediately, because it didn't belong in a place like this. Inside, the light was dim, filtered through gaps in the wood. It took a moment for my eyes to adjust. Stalls lined the sides, mostly empty. Tools hung where you'd expect them to be. Nothing looked immediately wrong. I saw as a man stood near the far stall, tall, broad-shouldered sleeves rolled up, like he had been working for hours without stopping. He didn't look surprised to see me. That was the first unsettling thing. Most people would have reacted questions, suspicion, curiosity. He had none of that. Just stillness, like he had already accounted for my arrival in his day. But it wasn't him that made me freeze. It was the sound again, closer, now from on behind the stacked bales near the back wall. I stepped forward before I even consciously decided to. "What is that?" I asked. My voice sounded too controlled for what I was hearing. The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at me the way people look at weather changes. Like the question would be whether it was happening, but whether you were prepared for it. Then he said quietly, "You should be here yet." That sentence didn't make sense in the way sentences are supposed to make sense. It was Tay, the warning. It wasn't Tay, an apology. It was an observation, like I had arrived on the wrong page of a book. I ignored him and moved around the hay. That was when I saw them. 3 small bundles. At first, my mind tried to correct the image. Blankets, animals, something ordinary, but then one of them moved just slightly. And I saw a tiny hand, fingers curling instinctively, searching for warmth. That was to their babies. 3 of them. Newborns. My body reacted before my thoughts caught up. I stepped back so fast I almost lost my balance. My voice broke slightly, and I hated that it did. I tried again. "What are they doing here?" The cowboy finally moved closer, but not toward me, toward them. Like distance mattered more in one direction than the other. "They re not doing anything," he said. "They re surviving." That word hit harder than I expected. Surviving. Because surviving meant something had already gone wrong. I looked at the barn again, trying to reframe it into something logical. Ranches had animals. Accidents happened. Maybe someone had dropped them off. Maybe no, I said out loud, more to myself than him. "This doesn't happen like this." The man gave a short, humorless exhale. "It does, when there is nowhere else for it to happen." I stepped closer now, despite every professional instinct telling me to stop treating this like my problem. I crouched near the bundles carefully, like movement itself might tip something fragile into collapse. One of the babies made a small sound, weak, tired, not crying so much as signaling existence. "How long?" I asked. "Long enough," he said. That wasn't an answer. I looked up at him sharply. That S, not acceptable. Something flickered in his expression at that, not anger, not defense. Something closer to exhaustion. "You think I don't know that?" he said quietly. There was something about the way he said it that made me realize this wasn't new to him, not the situation, but the judgment. The arrival of people with folders, people with numbers. I stood up again, stepping back into professional mode because it was safer there. "This is a legal issue," I said. "Child Protective Services needs to be contacted immediately. This environment is not—" "They separate them," he interrupted. The sentence wasn't allowed. It didn't need to be. It stopped me anyway. I frowned. They newborns, that's procedure. They need medical care. They need each other, he said. We stared at each other for a moment that felt longer than it should have, and then I realized something that made my chest tighten in a way I didn't have language for yet. He wasn't arguing about the law. He was arguing about what the law couldn't see. Before I could respond, the smallest of the three let out a weak sound again. The cowboy moved instantly, lifting a hand to adjust the blanket. Careful, practiced, like he had done this more times than anyone should have to. That S, when I saw it, he wasn't guessing. He wasn't improvising. He had been here, with them, for a while. I looked at him again. Really looked at him this time. The rough edges weren't performance. The tiredness wasn't temporary. This wasn't a man reacting to an emergency. This was a man living inside one. I came here to assess a property, I said slowly, like repeating it might restore order. Not this. His eyes met mine fully now. That S the problem, he said. That S what everyone says when they arrive. A silence stretched between us, not empty, full of something I couldn't categorize yet. I glanced back at my folder in the truck, through the barn door. Opening paper, numbers, structure, everything I trusted. Then back at the three small lives on the ground, wrapped in mismatched blankets that had clearly been gathered in urgency rather than comfort. My voice lowered without permission. Where is their mother? The cowboy did answer immediately. When he finally did, it wasn't what I expected. That is not the question that matters anymore. I felt something shift in my understanding of the situation, like a piece had moved in a puzzle. I hadn't realized I was already inside. Before I could press further, he straightened. You read the one they sent, he said. That's right. No, he said again, softer. I mean, you read the one who decides what happens next. That should have sounded dramatic, exaggerated, emotional, but he said it like it was simply the truth of the room. And suddenly, if I had come here to evaluate land at all, I looked at the triplets again, then at him then, back at my folder sitting in the truck, untouched, irrelevant, in a way I didn't want to admit yet, and I realized, with a discomfort that settled somewhere deeper than professionalism, that nothing in my training had prepared me for it. Instead of stock and a man who looked like he had already decided disappear into just because the system was easier than staying. The cowboy finally spoke again. If you going to call someone, he said, you should decide what you willing to break first. I didn't answer, because for the first time in a very long time, I didn't immediately know what the right answer was supposed to sound like. The ranch felt different after she left the barn, even though nothing about the land itself had changed. It was still the same dry stretch of western soil, still the same wind sliding low across the open fields, still the same distant silence that made you feel like the world had paused just long enough to listen. But something in the air had shifted, like a door had been opened inside a room no one was supposed to enter. I stayed in the barn, not because I needed to, because leaving would have meant pretending none of it had happened. The triplets were still there, wrapped in mismatched blankets, their small bodies fighting for warmth they should have never had to fight for. One of them made a soft sound every few minutes, not crying, not exactly. More like a signal, a reminder, a fragile insistence on existing in a world that hadn't made space for them. People think survival is loud. It isn't. It is quiet like that. I adjusted the blanket around the smallest one and checked the temperature of the bottle I had been warming in a basin of hot water earlier. Too many years on this land had taught me things I never expected to know. How to keep something alive when the nearest hospital is an hour away. How to improvise when help is always late. How to recognize the difference between panic and actual emergency. The woman had left fast. Too fast for someone who claimed she was just here for a property evaluation. I didn't blame her for that. Most people leave fast when reality stops matching paperwork. Still, I found myself replaying the look on her face when she saw them. Not disgust, not indifference. Something more dangerous than both disruption. Like someone had taken the rules she relied on and bent them slightly out of shape. That kind of person doesn't stay comfortable for long in places like this. A truck engine started outside. I didn't look up right away. I already knew it was to mine. By the time I stepped out of the barn, she was already walking back toward her vehicle, folder in hand. Posture straight in that way. City professionals carry themselves when they trying to convince the world they still have control of the situation. I leaned against the barn doorframe and waited. She stopped halfway to the truck. Not because I called out, because she felt it. People like her always do, eventually. She turned slightly, just enough to acknowledge I was still there. I need to make a call, she said. Her voice was steady again, controlled, back inside the structure she trusted. Go ahead, I replied. That made her pause. Most people expect resistance in moments like this. Argument. Emotional pressure. Something that confirms their decision already made sense. But I wasn't going to give her that. She studied me for a moment, like she was trying to decide whether I was careless or calculated. What exactly is your role here? She asked. It was the first question she had asked that mattered. I looked back toward the barn, instead of answering immediately. I live here. That doesn't answer my question. It answers mine. She exhaled slowly, like she was trying not to lose patience with a situation that did fit into her system. I am here to evaluate this property for acquisition, she said. That means I assess value, condition, risk, and legal complications. And right now, there are significant complications. Complications, I repeated. It sounded small compared to what was inside the barn. She followed my gaze without meaning to, then caught herself and looked away again. I assume you understand what I'm implying, she added. I do, I said. And you also understand I am required to report this immediately. Yes, that should have been the end of it. But it was T. Because she didn't move. She stayed where she was, one hand still on the door of the truck, like her body had accepted the instruction to leave. But something else had not asked. That when I realized something I didn't like admitting, she was just reacting to the situation. She was negotiating with herself. Most professionals don't hesitate when they think they've found a clear procedural obligation. They act it, they report, they move on. But she wasn't doing that. Still here. I need to understand something, she said finally. I waited. Are those babies abandoned? The way she said it made it sound like a classification problem, something that could be solved with the right label. No, I said. Her eyes narrowed slightly. No, they weren't left here like trash, I said. They were left here because there wasn't tea anywhere else left that wouldn't break them apart. That landed between us like something heavy. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she looked past me toward the barn again, but this time her focus wasn't on structure or condition or risk. It was on the fact that something alive had been placed where nothing in her reports had accounted for life at all. That doesn't change legal responsibility, she said carefully. I know. Her gaze snapped back to me. Then why are you resisting the obvious solution? That question carried more assumption than curiosity. So I answered honestly, Because I seen what your obvious solutions do. Her expression tightened. You to know what system I work in. I know the system that comes here after people like you leave, I said. That shut her down for a moment. Not because it was aggressive, because it wasn't tea. It was just tired. The wind picked up slightly, brushing across the open yard, shifting dust against the tires of her truck. Somewhere in the barn, one of the babies made a faint sound again, and her attention flickered toward it before she could stop herself. That flicker told me more than anything she had said so far. She cared, but caring wasn't the same as staying. I need to make a report, she said again, quieter this time. I nodded. Then make it. She frowned. You're not going to try to stop me? No. That surprised her. I could see it. People expect resistance when they re-about to do something that changes everything. They expect conflict to justify their decision. They expect someone else to carry the emotional weight of what they re-bout to trigger. But I wasn't going to carry that for her. If she made the call, it would be hers. She hesitated again. Then she asked, what happens after I make it? I looked at her directly now. That depends on who shows up first, I said. Her jaw tightened. That is not an answer. It is the only honest one. Silence again. Longer this time, she looked down at her folder, like she could find a clearer reality inside it. But paper does help when the problem is human. Yuri's telling me, she said slowly, that there are 3 newborns in a barn on this property, and you were asking me to delay reporting that. I'm not asking you to delay anything, I said. I'm telling you that whatever you report will decide whether those kids stay together or get erased into a system that doesn't care how they started. Her eyes sharpened at that. That system exists to protect them. No, I said, it exists to process them. That word process hung there. She didn't like it, I could tell, but she also didn't to dismiss it immediately. That was important, because most people already decide which side they re-on before they understand what they re-looking at. She was still deciding. That made her more dangerous than anyone who had already made up their mind. Why are you responsible for them? She asked. I looked back toward the barn again. That question wasn't simple either, because responsibility isn't always chosen. Sometimes it's what remains when everyone else has left. They were born here, I said finally. That is not responsibility. It is when there's no one else standing between them and a system that treats them like paperwork. She studied me for a long moment. Then she said something I didn't expect. I saw the way you held them. I didn't respond. You weren't guessing, she continued. You've done this before. Yes, I said. Her voice softened slightly. With your own children? That question landed differently, because it assumed something I was ready to explain. No, I said. Another pause. Then she asked underneath the question. Then why? I didn't answer immediately, because the truth wasn't simple enough for her report. It never would be. Finally, I said, because the first time I didn't a child disappeared into your system and never came back. Her expression changed at that. Not dramatically, just enough. Like something inside her had registered that this wasn't theoretical for me. I done control that system, she said. I know, I replied, and that was the problem. Neither of us controlled it, but both of us were standing inside the consequences of it. The barn creaked behind us. One of the babies cried now, not weak, not subtle, real hunger, real need. She turned fully toward it this time, and this time she didn't look away. I am going to need medical support here, she said. Yes, I agreed, and I am going to have to involve Child Protective Services. Yes. And you understand they will remove them. I didn't answer immediately, because that was the line everything stood on. I understand what they usually do, I said finally. She looked at me sharply. Then why aren't you stopping me? I met her eyes. Because I want to know what kind of person you are, I said. That silenced her completely. Not because it was a threat, because it wasn't tea. It was a test. And for the first time since she arrived, she didn't look like she was standing above the situation. She looked like she was inside it, and realizing that was exactly where she had always been. She turned back toward her truck slowly, but she didn't open the door right away. She stood there, still, listening to the barn. Listening to the sound she now couldn't unhear, and I knew, without needing to see her face, that whatever she decided next was going to change more than just this property. It was going to change her understanding of what rules were supposed to protect and what happens when they don't tea. The next morning, the ranch didn't feel like it had changed, but I did. That was the first thing I noticed when I stepped out of the small house before sunrise and saw the land stretching out the way it always had, wide, dry, indifferent, the kind of place that does care what happened yesterday because it has already moved on to whatever comes next. Except I hadn't moved on, not even close. The barn lights were still off, but I could hear her inside before I saw her. Not clearly, not words, just movement, careful, deliberate, unfamiliar, in a place that usually runs on instinct rather than instruction. There's a difference between someone working on a ranch and someone trying not to make a mistake on one. She was the second kind. When I pushed the barn door open, the smell hit me first. Warm milk, clean cloth, hay that had been shifted too many times in one night. And underneath all of it, something more fragile human exhaustion over something that hadn't been named yet. She was crouched near the makeshift bedding we had set up in the corner stall. Her hair was slightly undone, not in a way that suggested she had stopped caring, but in a way that suggested she should stop noticing. One of the triplets was in her arms, wrapped tightly against her chest, small face turned toward her collarbone like it had decided that was the only place in the world worth trusting at the moment. For a second, she didn't look like a corporate evaluator. She didn't look like someone who had arrived with a valuation report and a legal folder and a fixed price in her head. She just looked like someone holding something that had decided the world was too large and too sharp to survive alone in. The other two were asleep nearby, breathing unevenly, the kind of sleep newborns fall into when their bodies are still negotiating whether the world is safe enough to stay conscious in. She didn't look up when I entered. "I didn't call anyone yet," she said quietly, as if continuing a conversation from the night before that hadn't actually ended. "I know," I replied. That made her pause slightly, but she still didn't look at me. "I needed to understand what I was seeing first," she added. "Do you?" I asked. She finally looked up then. Not defensive, not confident. Just honest in a way I did expect from someone in her position. "I think I am starting to," she said. That starting mattered more than certainty ever would have. I leaned against the wooden post near the stall. That's the part most people skip. She adjusted the blanket around the baby in her arms. Skipping would have been easier. Easier, in teeth the same as right. She gave a short exhale that might have been a laugh if there had been anything light enough in it to qualify. "You sound like someone who has had to learn that the hard way." I didn't answer immediately because she was right. Outside, the wind shifted slightly across the open fields, pressing against the barn walls like something testing for weakness. The kind of wind that farmers don't talk about much because it doesn't do anything dramatic. It just slowly wears things down over time. She finally stood up, careful not to disturb the baby, and walked toward the small table we had set up with supplies, bottles, cloth, a thermometer I had found in an old storage drawer that probably hadn't been opened in years. Nothing official, nothing clean, just what we could gather quickly when the world didn't give us time to prepare. I need to document this properly, she said. From a legal standpoint, I asked. From every standpoint, she replied. That answer told me more about her than anything she had said before. She wasn't trying to reduce this into paperwork yet. She was trying to expand the paperwork to fit reality. Most people do the opposite. She picked up the notebook she had brought with her. Not the thick folder from yesterday that was still somewhere in her truck, but a smaller one now, the kind professionals use when they use trusting memory alone. She wrote something down, paused, then wrote more. Not emotional writing, observational, precise, but longer than necessary. That was something I noticed. People like her don't usually write more than they need to. I checked their breathing every 2 hours last night, she said without looking up. I know, I replied, again. That made her glance at me. How do you know I didn't sleep? I said. She studied me for a moment, like she was trying to decide whether that was responsibility or avoidance. Why? She asked. The question was simple. The answer wasn't T, because if something went wrong, I said, I wanted to be the one who noticed it first. That seemed to land somewhere between us without either of us naming it. She closed the notebook for a moment and looked down at the baby in her arms. They were small, she said softly. Not like a report, like a realization. They were supposed to be bigger than this, I said. Her eyes lifted slightly. You've I been around newborns before? Enough to know this isn't how it's supposed to look. Silence followed, not uncomfortable, just heavy with awareness then. She said something that surprised me again. I think I made a mistake yesterday. I looked at her. She didn't elaborate immediately, which told me she wasn't trying to be dramatic. She was choosing the words carefully. I reacted too quickly, she continued. I defaulted to procedure before understanding context. That's not a mistake, I said. That's training. Maybe, she replied, but training doesn't always mean it's right. That was the first time she sounded less like she was defending a system and more like she was evaluating it. She walked over and gently placed the baby back down with the others, adjusting the blankets with a care that didn't feel learned. It felt adapted. Like something in her had started adjusting itself to the reality of the barn instead of forcing the barn to fit her assumptions. Tell me something, she said, after a moment. I waited. If I make the report the way BM's supposed to, she continued. What happens to them? There it was. The real question. Not procedure, consequence. I didn't answer immediately because honesty in situations like this is TD about accuracy. It asks about what the other person is ready to carry. They'll be taken, I said. Finally, she nodded once and separated. Most likely she didn't respond right away. Instead, she turned back toward the babies, watching them breathe like she was trying to measure something that couldn't be quantified. That's not written anywhere in my guidelines, she said quietly. It is, I replied, just not in the part people like to read out loud. That made her look back at me sharply. You don't trust the system. I trust what I've seen it do, I corrected. Another pause then. She asked, and what do you want me to do instead? That question was dangerous, because it assumed I had a solution. I shook my head slightly. I don't want you to do anything, she frowned. That's not true. I met her gaze. I want you to understand what you read doing before you do it. That was closer to the truth. She set the notebook down again and leaned against the stall railing, looking out through the open barn doors toward the land beyond. I came here to evaluate property, she said, almost to herself. Not to make moral decisions about the foster system. That's the problem, I said. She looked at me. You think those are separate things, I continued. Her expression tightened slightly. They are separate. No, I said. Not here. The wind shifted again outside, louder this time, brushing dust across the threshold of the barn. One of the babies stirred, making a small sound that immediately broke whatever distance she had been trying to maintain. She moved without thinking, checking the blanket, adjusting it, making sure the sound didn't turn into distress. It was automatic now. That's how it starts. Not with agreement, with response. I need to know something else, she said after a moment. Go ahead. Why are you the one responsible for them? That question again. Different tone this time. Less legal. More personal. I looked down at my hands for a second before answering. Because I was here, I said. She shook her head slightly. That's not responsibility. It is when no one else shows up. That made her go quiet. Not because she disagreed, because she couldn't immediately prove I was wrong. She picked up her folder from the table again, finally opening it for the first time since yesterday. I watched her scan through pages she already knew by heart, like she was searching for a different answer hidden inside the same language. What if I delay the report? She asked suddenly. That surprised me, not the idea itself. The fact she said it out loud, I didn't answer immediately, because that was a small question. It was a turning point disguised as procedure. She looked at me again, just long enough to understand more. Medical support first, documentation. Then I nodded slowly. That's not against the rules, she added quickly, almost defensively. I didn't say it was, I replied. She exhaled, but it didn't sound relieved. It sounded like she was realizing how much space exists between rules and outcomes. I don't want to do the wrong thing, she said. No one does, I replied. She looked down at the babies again. But someone still ends up hurt, she whispered, and that was the part neither of us had a clean answer for. Because out here, in a barn far from offices and policies and legal certainty, the truth was about choosing between right and wrong. It was about choosing which kind of wrong you could live with. And I could see in the way she stood there now that she was beginning to understand exactly how heavy that choice could become. I noticed the change in her before she even said a word. It wasn't too dramatic. Nothing about this place ever changed in a way that demanded attention. It was always subtle, the kind of you only recognize after you've been standing in the same wind long to know when it stops pushing against you the same way. She walked into the barn just after sunrise, holding a thermos in one hand and her notebook in the other. Her hair was tied back this time, more controlled than yesterday, like she had decided that order could be restored if she just tightened the right things in her life. Her steps were slower, not uncertain, but measured in a way that told me she was trying to match the rhythm of the place instead of forcing it to match hers. That was new. People don't usually adjust that quickly. Or at all. The triplets were still asleep when she arrived. Two of them curled close together, the third slightly apart, but still within reach of warmth. I had learned quickly that separation, even in sleep, made them restless. They needed proximity, the way some people need air. Without it, something in them quietly starts to panic. She stopped a few feet from the stall and just watched them for a moment. Not like a report, not like a problem, just watching. Then she exhaled slowly. I stayed up all night reading foster placement protocols, she said without looking at me. I figured you would, I replied. That made her glance over. How? Because people like you don't leave uncertainty alone, I said. She didn't respond right away. Instead, she stepped closer to the stall, careful not to disturb the uneven sleep inside it. I thought I understood how this system works, she said quietly. I don't anymore. That was a confession I expected from her so soon. Or maybe I had underestimated how fast reality could dismantle certainty when it refused to behave properly. She set her notebook down on a wooden crate and leaned against the post beside it, arms folded loosely, not defensive, but trying to hold herself together in a different way. Not physically, mentally, like she was keeping something from spilling out that she hadn't decided how to name yet. I spoke with my supervisor last night, she added. That caught my attention. I looked at her fully now. She didn't meet my gaze immediately. I didn't file the report, she continued. The barn felt quieter after she said it, even though nothing about the environment had changed. The same creak of old wood, the same distant wind pushing against the outer walls, the same soft, uneven breathing of three newborns who had no idea they were the reason anything had shifted at all. I requested a 48-hour observation window instead, she said. I nodded slowly. That S not standard. No, she agreed, it is not. She finally looked at me then, and there was something different in her expression. Not rebellion, not fear, something more complicated. Do you understand what I just did? She asked. Yes, I said. She studied me for a moment, like she was trying to determine whether I fully grasped the weight of that decision. I delayed mandatory reporting, she said more firmly. If anything happens to them in that time, I am legally accountable. I understand, I replied. That answer seemed to frustrate her slightly. You were not reacting, she said. I am, I said, just not the way you expect. That made her pause. Most people expect emotional validation in moments like this. Agreement, gratitude, panic. Something visible that confirms the decision was significant. But I had lived too long in situations where visible reactions didn't change outcomes. What would you have done? She asked after a moment. That was a different kind of question. Not procedural, personal. I looked toward the triplets. I wouldn't have called anyone yet, I said. She frowned slightly. That S not an answer. It is, I said. It S, just not the one your system recognizes. That made her exhale sharply, but not in anger. More like exhaustion catching up to her reasoning. She walked over to the small table where we had set up supplies. Bottles, cloth, a thermometer, a few things that didn't belong together except by necessity. She picked up one of the bottles, checked the temperature instinctively, then set it back down again. You've done this before, she said quietly. Yes, I replied. With them? She asked. No, she turned toward me slightly. Then, how do you know what they need? I hesitated for a moment before answering, because the truth wasn't simple enough to be useful. You learn what absence looks like first, I said. Then you start recognizing what it needs to be filled. That seemed to stay with her longer than anything else I had said. She looked back at the triplets again, and this time, her gaze didn't move away quickly. She stayed there, as if trying to understand them, not as a case, not as a responsibility, but as something closer to reality than any category she had been trained to use. I reviewed their condition again this morning, she said. They restable, but barely. If they were in a hospital, they re-not. I said, I know, she replied quickly. That's not what I meant, but it was what she meant, even if she didn't want it to be. A silence stretched between us, then, not uncomfortable, but full of things neither of us had agreed to articulate yet. Outside, a truck passed somewhere far down the road. The sound barely reached the barn, but it reminded both of us that the world outside this place continued operating under rules that did not pause for situations like this. I spoke with animal control too, she said suddenly. That surprised me. I looked at her again. She noticed. I know, she added. It's not their jurisdiction. I just needed to understand what resources exist in rural emergency cases. And, I asked. Her expression tightened slightly. There aren't many, she admitted. That was the first time she said something that sounded like genuine realization instead of analysis. She opened her notebook again, flipping through pages filled with notes that were becoming less structured over time. I could see the shift even from a distance. At first, her writing had been clean, segmented, almost clinical. Now it was denser, longer sentences, more observations that didn't fit into categories, that how systems begin to crack. Not all at once, in accumulation. I didn't understand why you didn't just surrender them immediately, she said after a while, not looking up. That question had been coming. I had expected it. It wouldn't have kept them safe, I said. She stopped writing, then looked up. How do you know that? Because I've seen what happens in transit, I replied. She didn't respond immediately. Not because she didn't understand, because she did, and understanding didn't make it easier. She closed her notebook slowly. I need to ask you something directly, she said. Go ahead. If I had filed the report immediately, she said, what would have happened in the first 24 hours? I took a moment before answering, because I didn't want to soften it. They would have been logged, I said. Assigned, separated for transport assessment. Medical intake, split by availability. One might stay nearby temporarily. The others would likely be sent to different facilities depending on capacity. Her expression changed slightly, not dramatically. Just enough to show she was tracking every word. And after that, I said, they stopped being a single case. That sentence landed harder than the rest. She looked down at her hands for a moment, like she was trying to find a physical anchor for something that had started moving internally. They re-siblings, she said quietly. Yes, I replied. That matters, she added. It should, I said. Another silence, longer this time. She leaned back against the post again, but this time it didn't look like she was trying to steady herself. It looked like she was trying to stay upright in a different way, like the ground beneath her assumptions had become less reliable than she was used to. I didn't come here to make emotional decisions, she said. No one does, I replied. She let out a small, almost bitter breath. And yet, here we are. Yeah, I said, that was all there was to it. No correction. No solution. Just acknowledgement. She looked at the triplets again, then at me. Then back at the barn floor, like she was measuring something invisible. I want to stay within the law, she said. You still can, I replied. But the law does fully account for this, she said. No, I agreed. That seemed to frustrate her again, but differently. This time, not at me, at the gap itself. What do you do, she asked slowly, when the law and the right thing don't fully overlap? I didn't answer immediately, because that was the question underneath everything else. Finally, I said, you decide what kind of loss you can survive. She didn't respond. But she didn't to dismiss it either, and the more than anything, told me she was no longer standing outside this situation trying to evaluate it. She was inside it now, and she was starting to realize there was no clean way out, only choices that left different kinds of weight behind. That night didn't arrive like the others. Out here, nights usually come in quietly, like they've been waiting behind the horizon all day, and finally decide to step forward when no one is watching closely enough to argue with them. But this one felt different from the moment the light began to fade. Not darker, not colder, just heavier, like the air itself had decided to hold on to everything that had happened and refused to let it drift away. I stayed in the barn longer than I needed to. The triplets were finally asleep in a way that felt closer to fragile agreement than real rest. Two of them curled together again, instinctively, like even unconsciousness couldn't convince them they were safe, unless they could feel another body nearby. The third had drifted slightly apart, but kept one small hand stretched toward the others, as if distance even in sleep was something it had already learned to fear. The woman, she was still there. That surprised me more than anything else. Not because I thought she would leave. I never assumed that. People like her don't disappear quickly. They exit in stages. First physically, then mentally, then morally. But she hadn't done any of that yet. Instead, she had settled into the barn like it had started negotiating space with her, rather than resisting her presence. She was sitting on an overturned crate near the corner stall, notebook open, but untouched for the last half hour. Her posture wasn't tense anymore. It wasn't relaxed either. It was something in between, like her body had stopped arguing with the environment, even if her mind hadn't fully agreed to that surrender. She finally broke the silence without looking up. "I didn't file anything today," she said. "I did respond right away." That wasn't a confession. Not really. It was a status update. "I know," I said. She exhaled slowly, like she was testing how that sounded outside her head. "I requested another observation extension," she added. This time I did look at her. That was procedure anymore. Not fully. That was hesitations, because as structure. "Your system is going to question that," I said. "Yes," she replied. "They already did." I waited. She looked down at her notebook finally, then closed it without writing anything in it. "I told them I needed more time to assess environmental safety conditions," she said. "That's partially true," I replied. Her eyes lifted slightly at that. "Only partially?" she asked. I glanced toward the triplets. "The environment isn't the only thing you reassessing," I said. That made her pause. Not because it was insightful, because it was accurate. She leaned back against the wooden beam behind her, letting her head rest for a moment, like she was tired in a way sleep wouldn't affix. "Am I not supposed to be here this long without action?" she said quietly. "And yet you are," I replied. That small exchange hung between us longer than it should have. Outside, the wind moved across the open land again, but softer now, like even it had started paying attention to what was happening inside the barn instead of trying to push through it. She finally stood up. Not quickly, not decisively, just as if she had reached a point where sitting no longer felt like an answer. She walked over to the stall and looked down at the triplets for a long time without speaking. I watched her carefully, because this was the first time she was observing them like a subject. She wasn't evaluating health or condition or risk. She was just looking at them like they were real in a way that couldn't be reduced. One of them stirred slightly, making a small sound, not quite a cry. She instinctively reached out and adjusted the blanket before she even seemed aware she had moved. That was new again. Not the action, the instinct. "You've gotten faster," I said quietly. She didn't look at me. "I've been watching them all day," she replied. "That's not what I mean." She hesitated slightly, then finally turned toward me. "Then what do you mean?" "You don't hesitate before you touch them anymore," I said. That made her go still for a moment. Not defensive, just aware. I didn't realize I was hesitating before she admitted. "It's usually how it starts," I said. She looked back at the babies. Again, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the stall. "I spoke to my supervisor again," she said after a moment. I waited. They reconcerned about liability, she added. Of course they are, I replied. She gave a short, quiet breath that might have been a laugh if it had carried less weight. They want me to file immediately, she said. And you didn't, I said. No, she confirmed. Another pause. Then she added something that changed the air slightly. I told them I wouldn't tea until I had full medical assessment data. That was not a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. I nodded once. She watched me carefully now, like she was trying to determine whether I approved, disapproved, or simply understood. You not surprised, she said. No, I replied. Why not? Because you're trying to make a decision that does destroy you. I said that landed differently. I could see it. She looked down again, this time not at the babies, but at her own hands. That is not supposed to be part of my job, she said quietly. Your job was written by someone who never stood in a barn like this, I replied. She didn't argue. That silence told me more than any disagreement would have. After a while, she sat down again, slower this time, like her body was no longer resisting the idea of staying in one place. I need to ask you something, she said. Go ahead. If I report this tomorrow, she said, what exactly happens from your perspective? I exhaled slowly. That wasn't a procedural question anymore. That was a commitment to understanding consequences instead of categories. They come, I said. They document, they assess, they decide placement, they remove the babies from here. And you? They'll treat me as someone temporarily responsible for an unsafe placement. Her expression tightened slightly. And the barn. They clear it, I said. She looked back at the triplets. And the siblings, that was the question that mattered. I didn't answer immediately because the answer wasn't comfortable. They want to guarantee they stay together, I said finally. Her gaze sharpened. That is not policy, she said quickly. It is when there's no space, I replied. That made her go quiet again. Longer this time. The kind of silence where something inside a person starts rearranging itself without permission. I don't like that answer, she said eventually. I didn't think you would, I replied. She leaned forward slightly, elbows on her knees now, looking at the floor like it might offer something clearer than the conversation. I'm trying to figure out where my responsibility ends, she said. That's the wrong question, I replied. She looked up immediately. Then what as the right one? I didn't answer right away, because this was the part most people avoided. Finally, I said, where does the damage go if you do nothing? That question stayed with her longer than anything else I had said so far. She closed her eyes briefly, then opened them again. I can solve systemic failure, she said. No, I agreed, but you can decide how much of it you're willing to pass forward. That made her go quiet again. Outside, one of the babies made a small sound, sharper this time. Not to distress yet, but close enough that it cut through whatever distance she had been holding on to. She stood up immediately and checked them again, adjusting the blanket, touching the forehead of the smallest one to check warmth. This time, she didn't hesitate at all. I noticed that. So did she. I think because when she stepped back, she didn't return to her crate. She stayed standing. I didn't come here for this, she said quietly. No one does, I replied. She looked at me then. And for the first time since she arrived, she didn't look like she was measuring the situation against or policy. She looked like she was measuring herself against it. I'm going to stay the night, she said. That wasn't a question. It wasn't even a decision anymore. It was acknowledgement of what had already happened without permission. I nodded once. All right, I said. She exhaled slowly, like saying it out loud made it more real than she had expected. Then she looked back at the triplets one more time, and this time she didn't look away. I knew she hadn't slept. Not because she said so. Not because she looked exhausted in the way people usually do when they've been awake too long, but because of the way she moved through the barn that morning, careful, quiet, like sleep itself had become something she didn't fully trust anymore. The light outside was still soft, not fully committed to the day. That in-between hour when the ranch feels like it hasn't decided whether to reveal itself or stay hidden a little longer. I was already inside the barn when she arrived, checking on the triplets the way I had started doing, without thinking about it, just habit now, not urgency. They were stable, barely, but stable. That word had started to mean something different over the past few days. She stopped at the entrance before fully stepping in. That was new, too. Not hesitation exactly. More like respect for something she could categorize yet. Then she walked in, holding a paper cup of coffee in one hand, her notebook in the other, though she did open it. She didn't speak right away, neither did I. The barn had its own kind of silence in the morning, not empty silence. Full silence. The kind that carries weight because it's holding too many things at once: uncertainty, responsibility, the fragile rhythm of newborn breathing, and whatever decisions were still forming inside people who didn't really understand what they were becoming part of. She finally broke it. "I didn't send anything last night," she said. I nodded once. I figured that made her glance at me. "You figured." "People don't usually sleep their way through something like this," I said. She exhaled slightly through her nose, not quite a laugh, but close enough to show she understood the irony. "I reviewed their intake risk protocols." "Again," she said, stepping closer to the stall. "There's nothing in the guidelines that accounts for this specific situation. That's because guidelines don't mind to usually plan for people breaking before systems do," I said. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she looked at the triplets. One of them was awake now, small eyes barely open, moving its mouth in that instinctive search for something that wasn't there yet. She instinctively reached in, adjusting the cloth near its face, not even thinking about whether she was allowed to or not. That was another change. She wasn't asking permission anymore, not from me, not from the situation, not from herself. "I spoke to my supervisor this morning," she said quietly. I waited. She didn't look at me when she continued. "They want a formal report by tomorrow morning," she said. "That's fast," I replied. "It's as standard when infants are involved in non-registered care environments," she said automatically, like she was reading from something she no longer fully agreed with, but still remembered word for word. "Are we a non-registered care environment?" I asked. Her lips tightened slightly. "No," she admitted. "Not technically." That word technically had started doing a lot of work in her vocabulary lately. She closed her notebook without writing anything in it. Again, then set it down on the edge of a crate, like she had started trusting objects more than systems. "I requested an additional medical evaluation window," she added. I looked at her then. That wasn't standard anymore, not even close. "On what grounds?" I asked her. She hesitated slightly before answering. "Environmental stability concerns," she said. I nodded slowly. "That part is true." "Yes," she said softer, "it is." Then she added something that shifted the tone slightly. "But that is not why I requested it. I didn't respond right away because I already knew." She was starting to make decisions that couldn't be justified purely through paperwork. She moved closer to the stall, again resting her hand lightly on the wood rail, not touching the babies this time, just staying near them, like proximity itself had become part of her thinking process. "I don't understand why this feels different from other cases," she said. I leaned against the post beside her, not too close, not too far. It's not different, I said. She looked at me sharply. That is not true, she replied. I shook my head slightly. The system is the same. The rules are the same. The outcome paths are the same. Then why does it feel like it is? She asked. I looked at the triplets. Because this time, I said, you can see the people inside the system before it processes them. That made her go quiet. Longer than usual, the wind outside shifted again, brushing against the barn walls, carrying dust across the threshold like a reminder that the outside world didn't pause just because something inside had become complicated. She finally spoke again, but quieter. I pulled their preliminary medical indicators from the county database, she said. That got my attention. You accessed that already? She nodded. It is not complete, she added quickly, but enough to understand they were not formally registered at birth. That was surprising. Out here, distance created gaps that paperwork couldn't always fill. What does that mean for them? She asked. I didn't answer immediately, because she was asking for data. She was asking for reality. It means, I said slowly, that from the System S perspective, they didn't fully exist yet. She looked at me. That landed harder than she expected it to. That's not possible, she said. It's not supposed to be, I replied. She turned slightly away from the stall, practicing her against her forehead for a moment, like she was trying to reset something internally. I don't like that answer, she said quietly. I know, I said. She looked back at the babies again, then said something I didn't expect. If I delay the report again, I'm going to need a justification that will hold up under review. That sounds like you were looking for permission, I said. I'm looking for protection, she corrected. That distinction mattered. I nodded. Once then you won't find it in the report. She gave a small breath through her nose again. But this time there was no humor in it. I didn't come here to make exceptions, she said. No one does, I replied again. She looked at me then, fully, and yet that's all I've been doing since I walked into this barn. That was the first time she said it without resistance. Not as an accusation, as observation. We both looked at the triplets for a moment after that. One of them had drifted back to sleep, the others shifting slightly closer together, like their bodies were negotiating safety without asking anyone for permission. She spoke again, softer this time. I checked policy interpretation history, she said. That sounds like you didn't sleep at all, I replied. She didn't deny it. Every similar case in rural counties ends the same way, she continued. Removal, separation, placement, distribution, based on availability. She paused. None of them mention long-term sibling preservation in emergency newborn cases like this. That S, because long-term isn't the priority in emergency systems, I said. She looked at me sharply. Then what is? Short-term containment, I said. That word seemed to bother her more than the rest. Containment, not care, not protection. Containment. She stepped back slightly from the stall, as if needing space to process that. I don't think I can justify this indefinitely, she said. I nodded. I know, I replied. That honesty seemed to unsettle her more than anything else because it didn't fight her. It agreed with her limits. She turned away for a moment, walking a few steps toward the center of the barn, then stopping again like she wasn't sure where movement was supposed to lead anymore. I spoke to the hospital in the nearest county, she said after a moment. Medical transfer? I asked. Yes, she replied. They could take them temporarily. I waited. But, I asked. She didn't answer immediately. Then she said, they don't have neonatal capacity for 3 simultaneous cases without separation. That was the part neither of us needed to explain further. She looked back at me then. I don't know what the right decision is anymore, she admitted. That was the first time she said it that directly. Not uncertainty about procedure, uncertainty about outcome. I pushed off the post slightly. There is T1, I said. She frowned. That is not helpful. It is not supposed to be, I replied. That made her go quiet again. The kind of quiet that comes right before someone starts changing. They see structure they've been standing inside. She walked back toward the stalls, slowly, then rested her hand lightly on the wood again. Closer this time, I are going to extend the observation window again, she said. I nodded. That's not going to hold forever, I said. I know, she replied, but it holds long enough, she added. For what? I asked. She looked down at the triplets. For me to understand what I am actually responsible for, she said, and in that moment I realized something had already shifted inside her that couldn't be reversed easily. Not because she had rejected the system, but because she had started seeing what the system could not hold. And once someone sees that clearly, they don't go back to seeing only rules again. They start seeing consequences instead. And that changes everything. By the time she came back to the barn that morning, I already knew something had changed. Not from what she said. She hadn't said anything yet. Not from how she walked either. Her steps were still careful, still measured, still trying to match the rhythm of the place, like she had been doing for the past few days. It was something smaller than that. Something in the way she didn't immediately look at the triplets when she entered, like she already knew what she was going to see and was trying to prepare herself before confirming it. That kind of pause doesn't come from procedure. It comes from fear that has learned how to think. She stopped at the entrance again, but this time she didn't linger, stepped in fully, set her notebook down on the crate without opening it, and exhaled slowly like she'd been holding her breath since before sunrise. I filed the extension, she said. I nodded once. I assumed you would. She looked at me sharply, like she was trying to decide whether that meant I understood her, or simply expected her to break rules slowly instead of quickly. It's not an extension anymore, she said, after a moment. It is a formal deviation request. That made me look at her more closely. That is a bigger step, said. Yes, she replied. It is. She walked over to the stall, but didn't touch anything yet, just looked. All three of them were awake now, not crying, just watching the world with that fragile, unformed attention newborns have when they have indeed decided whether reality is safe enough to commit to fully. I got the updated guidance from the county supervisor, she continued. And, I asked. She hesitated, then said it. Anyway, if I don't file within 48 hours, the case will be escalated automatically. I nodded slowly. That was the system tightening its grip again. She finally reached in and adjusted one of the blankets more slowly than before, like she was trying not to let instinct override awareness. I spoke to them about sibling grouping, she added. That got my attention. They responded, I asked. She gave a short, humorless breath. They said placement depends on capacity, she replied. Which means, I asked, though I already knew. It means they can guarantee they stay together. The barn felt quieter after she said it, even though nothing physically changed. She stood there for a moment longer, then finally stepped back from like she needed, distance from something that wasn't the babies themselves, but what was about to happen to them in places she couldn't see. I don't think I can do this the way they want me to, she said quietly. I didn't respond immediately, because that wasn't Tia's statement about procedure anymore. That was the beginning of rupture. You are not supposed to think about it that way, I said. She looked at me. What way? Like you read the only thing between them and what happens next, I said. Her expression tightened slightly. I am the one writing the report, she said. Yes, I agreed. But you, not the one who built the system it goes into. That didn't comfort her, it made her more alert. I reviewed 3 previous cases last night, she said suddenly. Why? I asked. Because I needed to understand precedent, she replied automatically. And what did you learn? I asked. She hesitated, then said, in all 3 cases, separation happened within 72 hours. And? I pressed. She looked down at her hands. And the siblings were not reunited, she said quietly. That sentence stayed in the air longer than anything else she had said that morning. Not because it was new, because she had stopped saying it like data and started saying it like consequence. She walked away from the stall again, slower this time, moving toward the center of the barn where the light came in through the open doors in a thin, pale sheet. She stood there for a moment, looking out at the land like she was trying to find something in it that could offer clarity. I didn't come here to make emotional decisions, she said again. Her voice wasn't defensive anymore. It was tired. No one does, I said. She shook her head slightly, but that's all I've been doing, she said. I didn't argue, because she was right. She turned back toward me. I filed a second deviation request this morning, she said. That made me pause. Second? I asked. She nodded. For sibling preservation under emergency neonatal conditions, she said. That is not standard language, I replied. No, she admitted. It is not. She walked back toward the stall, but this time she didn't stop at the edge. She leaned lightly against it, looking down at the triplet again like she was trying to anchor herself to something real. I don't think they were going to approve it, she said. Probably not, I agreed. That honesty made her exhale sharply through her nose again. But you still did it, I added. Yes, she said. Why? I asked. She didn't answer immediately. That pause mattered, because it wasn't procedural thinking anymore. It was personal cost calculation. I didn't know how to explain it in their language, she said finally. Try mine, I replied. She looked at me then, and for the first time, she didn't try to translate herself into policy before speaking. I don't think separating them is neutral, she said quietly. I nodded. She continued. And don't think I can pretend it just because the system requires it. That was the point where something shifted fully, not in the barn, in her. I spoke to my supervisor, again, she added. And, I asked. She gave a small, almost resigned breath. They said I am becoming personally involved, she said. That's usually what they call it, I replied. She looked at me sharply. What does that mean? She asked. It means you no longer only processing a case, I said. You responding to it. She didn't like that answer. I could see it in her face, because it wasn't wrong. She walked back toward the center of the barn again, slower now, like she was trying to understand where she had crossed from observer into participant without noticing the exact moment it happened. I didn't choose that, she said. No, I agreed. You did. That made her stop. She turned toward me. Then why does it feel like I did, she asked. That question hung between us for a long moment, because the answer was simple. Finally, I said, because once you see something clearly, not seeing it again feels like a choice, too. She closed her eyes briefly. Not long, just enough to steady herself. When she opened them again, there was something different in her expression. Not clarity, not resolution. Something closer to acceptance of complexity she hadn't wanted to carry. I can delay the report one more time, she said. I nodded. But she added quickly. I know, I said. She looked back at the triplets. If I lose my position over this, she said quietly, it wouldn't change what happens to them. No, I agreed. That truth seemed to land heavily. She stepped closer to the stall again, this time resting her hand on the wood longer, not adjusting anything, just staying in contact with something physical. I keep thinking I'm supposed to find a solution that doesn't hurt anyone, she said. I shook my head slightly. That's not what you two aren't supposed to find, I said. She looked at me. Then what? She asked. Which hurt you can live with, I said. That silence afterward was different from the others. It wasn't confusion anymore. It was recognition. She stayed there for a long time, just watching them breathe. Then finally said, almost quietly, I think I already know my answer. I didn't ask her what it was. Because some answers only become real when they are carried forward in action, not spoken out loud. And for the first time since she arrived at the barn, I realized she was standing at the edge of a decision anymore. She was already inside it. She just hadn't named it yet. I knew she was going to leave before she said anything. Not because she acted like someone preparing to go. There was no packing, no sudden distance, no final look around the barn like people do when they trying to memorize a place they about to abandon. It was something quieter than that. Something in the way she moved through the space that morning, like she was no longer trying to belong to it, but also no longer resisting it. She came in just after dawn, holding her notebook but not opening it, her hair slightly damp from what I assumed was cold water rather than sleep. She didn't look at the triplets immediately, which had become her first instinct over the past days. Instead, she stood near the entrance for a moment, breathing like she was measuring something inside herself rather than outside. I submitted the final extension request last night, she said. I nodded slowly. And they acknowledged it, she replied. But they said there will be no further delays after this. That was the system drawing its line. She finally walked over to the stall, but she didn't touch anything this time, just looked. All three of them were awake now, small faces, turning slightly toward sound, toward movement, toward anything that suggested the world was still consistent enough to interpret. They restable, she said quietly. Yes, I replied. That's what matters to them, she added. I didn't answer, because she was right about that too. She leaned lightly against the wood, not pressing into it, just resting there, like she wasn't sure how much longer she'd be allowed to stay close to anything without consequences. I spoke to the hospital again, after a moment, and I asked. They confirmed what you already told me, she said. They cannot guarantee joint placement, not even temporary. That sentence didn't need further explanation anymore. We had both reached the point where explanation was just repetition of something we already knew was broken. She exhaled slowly. I can stop thinking about what happens after they leave here, she said. I looked at her. That S, because you're not supposed to stop thinking about it, I said. She gave a short, tired breath. That's not what my job is supposed to feel like, she said. Jobs don't always feel like what they're supposed to feel like, I replied. That made her go quiet, longer than usual. Outside, the wind shifted across the open land again, pushing a thin layer of dust along the barn threshold, the kind of wind that didn't announce itself, just slowly changed the way everything felt without asking permission. She finally spoke again, softer this time. I am going to file the report today, she said. I nodded. I know, I replied. She looked at me then, and, for the first time, there was no hesitation in her expression. Not certainty exactly, but something more grounded than she had carried before. But I'm going to attach an exception recommendation, she added. That made me pause slightly. On what basis? I asked. Sibling integrity. Under developmental dependency, she said. It won't be binding, but it will be in the record. I nodded slowly. That's as far as you can push it, I said. Yes, she replied. It is. She turned back toward the triplets, watching them for a long time without speaking. One of them made a small sound, and she reacted immediately, not in panic, but in instinct, adjusting the cloth near its face, like she had done 100 times now, without thinking. Then she stopped, as if realizing she had crossed a line she no longer needed to defend. I'm not sure I am the same person who arrived here, she said quietly. I didn't respond immediately, because that wasn't a question, it was recognition. You're not, I said. Finally, that honesty didn't shock her anymore. It settled. She straightened slightly, pulling her hand back from the stall. I need to go into town, she said. I nodded. To file? Yes, she replied. There was no dramatic pause after that. No emotional break. Just a simple acknowledgement that something had reached its necessary point. She walked back toward the entrance, then stopped halfway, and turned slightly. I don't know what happens after this, she said. I looked at her. You go back to your system, I said. She nodded, slowly. And you stay here, she added. Yes, I said. That should have sounded like separation. But it didn't, not entirely, because neither of us moved like this place was finished with us yet. She left the barn just after that. The sound of her truck starting up carried across the land in a way that felt louder than usual, even though nothing about it had changed. I stayed inside the barn for a while after she left, watching the triplets breathe, listening to the way this adjusted itself again, like it was trying to understand what kind of absence this was. It wasn't empty, not really, just waiting. When she came back later that afternoon, the sky had changed slightly, not in weather, but in tone. The light was softer, lower, like the day had begun preparing itself for something it couldn't fully name. She didn't come into the barn immediately. I saw her outside first, standing near the fence line, looking out over the land for a long time before she moved again. When she finally stepped inside, she looked different again. Not lighter, not heavier, just resolved in a way that no longer depended on hesitation. I filed it, she said. I nodded once. And the exception? I asked. It's in the system, she replied. It wasn't to guarantee anything, but it will be reviewed before placement. That was as far as it could go. She walked over to the stall, but this time she didn't look at them immediately. She looked at me first. I want to be assigned to this case anymore. After today, she said. I nodded. That S standard, I replied. Yes, it is. But neither of us said it like it was normal. She finally turned toward the triplets. They were awake again, watching, not crying, just existing in that fragile way newborns do when they are still deciding how much of the world they want to accept. She stood there for a long moment without touching anything. Then she said something I didn't expect. I don't think I did this perfectly, she said. I shook my head slightly. No one does, I replied. That made her exhale softly. But I think I did it honestly, she added. I nodded. Yes, I said. You did. She stayed there a little longer, then slowly stepped back from the stall. I have to leave tomorrow morning, she said. I looked at her. She didn't wait for a response. She already knew there wasn't one that mattered. That evening, she stayed in the barn longer than usual again, but not in the same way as before. She wasn't holding on to the space anymore. She was simply existing within it, like someone just finishing a conversation that didn't need more words. At some point, she sat on the crate near the corner, a began notebook closed beside her. I used to think responsibility was about making the correct decision, she said quietly. I leaned against the post. And now? I asked. She looked at the triplets. Now I think it about knowing what you were choosing to lose, she said. That stayed in the air longer than anything else that day. The next morning, she left before sunrise. I saw the dust from her truck disappear down the road, slowly swallowed by distance, the way all things eventually are out here. The barn felt quieter again after that. Not empty, just changed. The triplets were still there, still breathing, still together, and for now that was the only certainty that mattered. She didn't come back the way I expected her to. Not that I was sure what I expected anymore. By the time she returned to the ranch, the sun was already leaning toward late afternoon, the kind of light that stretches long across the land and makes everything look a little older than it really is. The barn was quieter than usual, not because anything had changed inside it, but because something had already shifted in the way we both understood it now. The triplets were asleep when she arrived. That detail mattered more than it should have. She stopped at the entrance like she always did now, but this time she didn't hesitate. She to measure the space before entering. She just stepped in, closed the door behind her, and stood there for a moment like she was confirming that this place still existed, the same way she had left it. I got the preliminary decision, she said. I looked at her. And, I asked. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she walked over to the stall, slower than before, and looked down at them. There was something different in the way she stood now. Not distance, not closeness. Something in between that had stopped asking permission from either. They approved temporary sibling preservation, she said finally. That made me pause. Temporary, I repeated. She nodded. It's not permanent placement, she said. But it means they will not be separated during the first transfer cycle. That should have sounded small. It wasn't. Not here. Not for them. She reached in slowly, adjusting the blanket around the smallest one. But her hand lingered longer than necessary this time. Not checking warmth, not checking safety, just staying. But, she exhaled quietly. But I am off the case, she said. That part hung heavier than the rest. I looked at her fully now. They reassigned you, I said. No, she replied. I requested removal. That surprised me more than anything else she had said in days. Why? I asked. She didn't look at me immediately, because the answer wasn't procedural anymore. It wasn't objective for me anymore, she said quietly. That was the first time she said it out loud without trying to justify it. I nodded slowly. She stepped back from the stall and finally turned toward me. I couldn't write about them like they were a case file, she said. Not after everything. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. We both knew what everything meant now. The barn felt different again in that moment, not because anything physical changed, but because the distance between language and reality had finally collapsed enough that she could rebuild it quickly anymore. She walked over to the crate and sat down, but not like before, not tired, not overwhelmed, just present. I signed the closure report before I left the office, she added. I nodded. And? I asked. She looked down at her hands. I wrote the exception recommendation as a formal concern, she said. It's now part of the permanent file. That's all you could do, I said. Yes, she replied. It is. Silence settled between us again, but it was the same kind anymore. This one felt like completion, not uncertainty. She leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows on her knees, looking at the floor for a moment before speaking again. I don't think I would have done that a month ago, she said quietly. Done what? I asked. Stayed this long, she said. Fought this hard for something I couldn't measure. I didn't answer immediately, because she was right. She looked up at me then. I used to think people like you were just resisting systems, she said. And now? I asked. She gave a small, almost tired smile. Now I think systems sometimes resist people, she said. That landed differently. Not as criticism, as understanding. Outside, the wind moved across the fields again. Softer now, like it had also decided not to push too hard against anything that didn't need to be moved. She stood up again after a while and walked back to the stall. The triplets were still asleep, but one of them shifted slightly, instinctively moving closer to the others, without waking fully. She watched that movement for a long time, then said something quietly. "They re-staying together," she said. "Yes," I replied. "At least for now," she added. I nodded. "Sometimes for now is the only kind of guarantee there is," I said. She didn't argue. Instead, she placed her hand lightly on the wood again, the same place she had stood so many times before, but this time without tension. "I leave tomorrow," she said. I looked at her. She didn't wait for response, because there was T1 that changed anything anymore. "I know," I said. She nodded once. That was it. No resolution, no dramatic ending, just acknowledgement of a boundary that had already been drawn. That evening, she stayed longer than I expected, not because she needed to, but because she no longer seemed in a hurry to leave things unfinished. We didn't talk much. There wasn't much left to clarify. At some point, she stood near the stall again and looked down at the triplets, the way someone looks something they didn't expect to matter until it already does. "I think I understand something now," she said quietly. I waited. "Not everything needs to be categorized to be real," she added. I nodded slowly. "Usually the part people learn too late," I said. She gave a small breath that wasn't quite a laugh. "Or don't learn at all," she replied. Then she stepped back. The next morning, she left before sunrise again. This time, there was no hesitation at the door. No final glance that tried to hold on to anything. Just movement. Just decision. I watched her truck disappear down the road until it became part of the distance again, like everything else eventually does out here. The barn stayed the same, but something inside it didn't. The triplets were still together, still breathing, still here. And for now, that was enough to call the day complete without needing to explain why. The morning they came to take the official transfer was quiet in a way that didn't feel natural, even for this place. Not peaceful, not calm, just held. Like the land itself was waiting to see how people would behave when everything finally had to be made real on paper. I was already in the barn when the truck arrived. Not because I was expecting it at that exact minute, but because I had stopped sleeping properly the night before. There are differences between being awake and being ready, and I had settled somewhere uncomfortable in between. The woman arrived shortly after. She wasn't wearing the same expression she used to have when she first stepped onto this ranch. Back then, everything about her felt like it was arranged in advance, decisions already formed, language already prepared, distance already measured. Now, she looked like someone who had learned what it meant when decisions stop belonging to systems and start belonging to people. She didn't say hello, neither did I. We both knew this wasn't a moment for language that didn't carry weight. The officials came in quietly, 2 county workers and a medical coordinator. Professional, neutral, careful not to look too long at anything that might make the situation feel like something other than procedure. One of them checked the paperwork, another confirmed identification tags, the third prepared the transport carrier, lined with soft thermal padding and standardized medical monitoring. Everything correct. Everything clinical. Everything incomplete. The triplets were awake. That was the hardest part. Not crying, not distressed. Just awake in that way newborns sometimes are when they sense change before they understand it. The woman stepped forward instinctively when one of them made a small sound, but she stopped herself halfway, as if remembering she no longer had authority over intervention. That hesitation cost her more than anything she had written in reports. The coordinator asked for confirmation. I gave it. The woman did not now aloud, but she didn't look away either. When they lifted the first one, the sound it made wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The barn absorbed it anyway, like it understood exactly what was being taken, even if no one else fully did. The second followed. Then the third. 3 movements. 3 separations of space that used to be one shared rhythm. The woman stood very still the entire time. Not because she was detached, because she wasn't allowed to interfere anymore. When the truck doors closed, there was no dramatic silence after, just continuation. Life continuing in a direction that didn't pause for emotional processing. The officials left quickly. They always do. Only the 2 of us remained, and the barn, and the space where something had been that no longer was. She finally exhaled after a long time, like she had been holding something in her chest since before the truck arrived. They approved my exception recommendation, she said quietly. I looked at her. Partially, she added. What does that mean? I asked. It means they try to keep the proximity if placement allows, she said. But there are no guarantees. I nodded, slowly, so nothing changed, I said. She shook her head slightly. Something changed, she replied. It's just not something I can measure anymore. That was the difference. She was speaking like someone inside the system now. She was speaking like someone who had seen its edges. She walked over to the stall, now empty, and placed her hand on the wood the same way she had done so many times before. But this time it wasn't T checking anything. It wasn't grounding herself in procedure or observation. It was just contact. I know what I'm supposed to take from this, she said quietly. I leaned against the post. Maybe you're not supposed to take anything, I replied. She gave a small, tired breath. That doesn't feel right, she said. It rarely does, I said. She nodded once, then looked at me. I'm going back to the city tomorrow, she said. I nodded. And you? She asked. I looked out at the land beyond the barn doors. I stay, I said. She didn't respond immediately. Not because she disagreed, because she understood that answer now in a way she hadn't T when she first arrived. After a moment, she walked toward the entrance, then stopped. Without turning fully back, she said, Do you think I did the right thing? I took my time before answering, because that question wasn't about correctness. It was about weight. I think you did what you could carry, I said. That seemed to be enough. She nodded once, then she left. The barn stayed quiet for a long time after that. Not empty, just different. I stood there for a while, looking at the space where everything had happened, and realizing something simple that took too long to understand. Some things don't end cleanly. They just stop being held in the same place. Outside, the wind moved across the fields like it always did. The land didn't change, but I did, and for the first time in a long time, that felt like the only kind of ending this place ever really offered. This story exists within the realm of fiction, where imagination shapes reality. Any similarities to real-life individuals, organizations, or events are entirely coincidental. The author does not endorse or represent any real entity through the content of this work.
At its core, this story is not really about abandoned triplets, a cowboy, or a corporate evaluation gone wrong. It is about something much quieter and more difficult to define, the moment when human responsibility stops being a matter of rules and starts becoming a matter of conscience. In the beginning, the woman arrives with certainty. She represents systems, procedures, and decisions that are meant to be clean, efficient, and emotionally neutral. Her job is to evaluate, document, and report. In theory, nothing personal should interfere with that process. But the West has never been a place that respects theory for long. When she finds 3 newborn triplets in a barn, reality interrupts the language of policy. Suddenly, what is correct on a paper is no longer clearly right in life. On the other side, the cowboy represents something just as complicated. He is not a man of perfect answers. He does not stand for law or rebellion in a simple way. Instead, he stands for lived experience, for the kind of knowledge that comes from staying when leaving might be easier, and from protecting something without being able to fully explain why it matters. He is rough not because he lacks feeling, but because life has forced him to strip emotion down to something usable, something that can survive hard land and harder choices. The moral weight of the story comes from what happens between them. The slow dismantling of certainty. Neither character begins as wrong, and neither ends as right in a traditional sense. Instead, both are forced into a deeper understanding that ethical decisions in real life rarely offer perfect outcomes. The woman learns that neutrality can sometimes become a form of harm when it ignores human connection. The cowboy learns that protection without transparency can still create its own kind of suffering. And both discover that compassion is not a feeling that fits neatly inside systems, but an action that often requires risk. The abandoned triplets are not just a plot element, they are a moral mirror. They represent vulnerability without language, dependency without choice, and the kind of responsibility that cannot be delayed or delegated. Through them, the story asks a difficult question. When institutions fail to fully protect the most vulnerable, what responsibility falls on the individuals who witness that failure firsthand? One of the most important lessons of this story is that doing the right thing is not always about following rules, but about understanding consequences that rules may not fully account for. However, it also warns against the opposite extreme, making emotional decisions without structure or foresight. True responsibility lies somewhere in the uncomfortable middle, where logic and empathy must coexist even when they conflict. Ultimately, this story is about transformation through exposure. The woman does not abandon her professional identity, and the cowboy does not abandon his grounded realism. Instead, both are expanded by the experience of caring. They learn that moral clarity is rarely immediate, and that growth often comes from sitting too long in uncertainty rather than escaping it too quickly. For the audience, the lesson is simple but not easy. People are not defined by systems alone, nor by emotion alone. They are defined by what they choose to carry when no option feels entirely correct. And sometimes, the most human decision is not the one that resolves everything, but the one that refuses to ignore what is quietly asking to be seen.